Hi everyone, good afternoon. So I'm going to start by telling you about my favorite film as a child. So whenever I was growing up, I used to love a film called Back to the Future. Has anybody seen that film? I love Back to the Future. The star of the film is a teenager called Marty McFly. And Marty has a magic car that can travel in time. And he spends half of the film in 1960 and the other half of the film in the future, where they have flying cars and they have watches that have video phones on them, and they have hoverboards instead of skateboards, and I think it's a wonderful film. Now, the funny thing about my life and what I do for BT is I run BT's voice networks. So I'm a bit like Marty McFly now, because half of my life is spent crawling around telephone exchanges that were built in 1970 in the UK, and the other half is spent building the most exciting voice over IP based solutions on iPhones and tablets and on Android devices. So it's a very, very interesting job. And so I'm passionate about voice services, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So let me start with some context about BT. British Telecom, as it used to be known, is the largest and the oldest telco in the world. That's what we claim to be. And if I give you a little story about British Telecom, we've got 24 million phone lines that we still use in the UK. We've got 5,400 telephone exchanges. We have got about 90,000 employees, many of whom drive vans around the UK, helping to maintain that network. And BT makes about £19 billion. I have absolutely no idea how to convert that into rupees, but it's quite a number of rupees. Now, at the heart of BT's products and services remains voice. Voice is still really important. It's important for two reasons. The first reason it's important is because people will always need to speak to each other. The second reason it's important is because the landline that used to be used primarily for voice is now used for data. And over that data connection, we send television, we send broadband, we send the internet, all of those fantastic things come over that connection. So people will always need voice, and people will always need the landline. The question really that we need to think about as we think about the next generation of voice is, well, how will it change? What will happen? So whenever you buy a service from a telco like BT, you'll want to buy your broadband connection, and you want that to be really fast. You'll want to buy your television service from us, and you'll want the content to be really good, but you'll still want to sort of have a phone service from us. And that's what my job is. What will that phone service look like as we move forward? So the first thing that we need to look at, I have an interesting belief system. I think that people talk about legacy as though it's bad. They talk about old things like they're bad and should be replaced. I have a slightly different outlook. I think that legacy is a state of mind. It's not actually true. For example, if something is really old, we don't necessarily throw it away. If it's really old and it still works, we keep it, we love it, we're used to it. If something is really old, it doesn't mean that it's no good anymore. If something was built in 1980, it doesn't mean that we can't make it relevant today. So the first thing I would say about innovation doesn't just have to be about new things. Innovation can be about taking the older things that we've already got and using them in new and exciting ways. It can be taking the older things and continuing to make money using those things. Now that brings me on to my second key point, which is that when I think about innovation, I think one thing we must think about very carefully is there's no point in innovation if it doesn't make money. Innovation is about making money. Innovation is about coming up with products that customers will love. It's about coming up with products that will give us as a company a margin so that when we sell it to the customer, we make a good percentage of profit on that. Now, when you think about voice, what we have learnt in the UK is that people don't want to pay for voice. Now, what that means is that you have to provide voice for as low a cost as you possibly can. And that's where the first element of innovation that we have in the UK is, it might sound a bit upside down, but our first innovation is that we're going to continue to use the legacy network for as long as we can. But as we do that, we're going to innovate around that network. And I'll talk to you later about some of the apps on the iPhones and things that BT is producing. But basically, what we're looking to do is to marry the brand new technology of voice with the older technology that is still working really well and we can continue to make money from. So that's the first thing to think about in innovation from my perspective. Innovation can be about reusing old things that we have already. Of course, there has to be a future. You can't continue to always use the old things. If we look at cars, eventually you have to have a new model. There has to be a new model. It's very dangerous to not look at the future. Everyone's familiar with Kodak. Kodak is an example of a company who forgot to look at the future. They were making lots of money selling films and developing films and producing photographs, and they sold cameras. They forgot to notice that digital cameras were coming, and as a result of that, Kodak, well, we don't hear about them so much anymore. Now, the same is true in voice. You can innovate around your existing technology and make more money, but you can only do that for a certain length of time. In BT, we believe that we will be able to leverage our existing networks until around 2020. Now, what that does, by using innovation to look after our old network, it gives us room to innovate and come up with new solutions so that over the next 8 years, we can launch advanced voice over IP services that our customers really, really want. And that's how we marry looking after the legacy network with working on the innovative new services. So what's happening in the world of voice then? It's quite interesting. So if you go back 5 years, what did people believe? And this is an interesting thing about innovation. As time passes, what felt like the future turns out either not to be true or further away than we thought. So if I go back to my favorite film, I still do not have a flying car. And yet in the film, by this period, I was meant to have a flying car. I was meant to have a hoverboard, and I keep asking my wife, where is my hoverboard? I want one for Christmas. Not everything comes true. And if you look at voice around the world, it's different in every country, but there are some big trends. 5 years ago, we believed that everybody would have moved to voice over IP. We thought that voice over IP would be prevalent. We thought that businesses would use Skype and things like that. We thought that consumers would no longer have a landline. They would instead move to using voice over IP. 5 years on, they haven't. And there are a set of reasons why that is true. The reason that people continue to use their landline is because they need it for their broadband. It's because they've got used to making phone calls on it. The reason that businesses still have phones on the desks is because, well, we've already bought them. Why would I buy something new if I've got something that already works? So the problem with voice, and the reason that perhaps voice over IP has not accelerated as quickly as was originally forecast, is actually because people don't need it. I can already make a phone call. I've already bought my existing phone network. It's very expensive to replace a phone network if the new network that you provide does exactly the same thing as the old network. People aren't willing to pay for that. Now, what that means is that the strategy of sustaining your existing network as long as you can, again, is very sound. So what are the trends now today in voice over IP? I'll tell you the big ones that we see within BT. The first thing that's happening is voice is changing. It used to be that voice was a network. It was a very physical thing. If you think back to how voice used to be, you'll have seen the pictures of the ladies and gentlemen in telephone exchanges connecting it up. Do you remember all that? That was quite cool. In 1976, we rolled out the digital telephone exchange, and that replaced the people that had to connect the wires up with electronics. Now, at that time, it's all very physical, and today it's still very physical. It's machinery, it's mechanics. Now, what's the first trend that's happening in voice is voice is changing to be software-based. So today, we have a telephone exchange, which is the size of a ginormous building. Tomorrow, we'll have a telephone exchange, which sits on a PC. And in BT, we've already built that exchange. You'll remember, perhaps some of you, BT acquired a company called Ribbit. Ribbit was Silicon Valley's first telco. And the premise of Ribbit was that it was a software-based switch, a software-based exchange. That's the first trend that we see. Networks will move from being physical things made out of machinery into software-based solutions. That's the first trend. The second trend that's happening in the market is that people aren't willing to pay for voice. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, what will they be willing to pay for? So at a point in time, there's a unified communications will become really important to the world. The thing that we need, though, is a crystal ball. So again, if I go back to my favorite film, or I'll mention another film, there's another film with Arnold Schwarzenegger called Total Recall. And in that film, they made video calls. In Star Trek, they made video calls. Everything was in one place. But do you know what? Nobody makes video calls yet. And what's not clear is when they will. So at a point in time, people will start to use unified communications. And the thing that we need to do is to, when we're innovating today and thinking about the solutions that we're building, we need to be building an architecture that's really defensive so that as the industry changes, we're monitoring it very closely so that we're able to understand what types of innovations we might need to do next. And that's really what our goal is in BT. How do we build a set of solutions today that are really attractive and start to pull our customers from the legacy network onto the new innovative voice over IP solutions? And the reason we care about that is because we see a codec problem in the future. And what my job is to find the sweet spot between building innovative new voice over IP solutions and loading those platforms up and continuing to make money from my legacy platform, which still works really well. If I leave too many people on the legacy network, then by the time I get to 2020, I'll have a set of exchange equipment that will be falling apart and everyone will be shouting about them not being able to make a phone call. But if I move too quickly, we all know that new platforms are less stable than old platforms. So if you move too quickly on the new solutions, then they fall over and everything is bad. So you have to find the sweet spot between continuing to make money by innovatively using your legacy platforms and building innovative new solutions that your customers really want and finding reasons why the customer would want them. So I'll tell you about the products that BT's just put into the market for voice over IP. The first one is a solution called IP Exchange. And what that's about, there's something funny is happening with voice over IP. There's no commonality in the protocol or the codec that is used around the world in voice over IP networks. A voice over IP network run by Vodafone will use a very different protocol and codec as a voice over IP network run by perhaps Orange or even BT. We see advantage in that, and BT has built a network called SDIN, or Strategic Interconnect. And what we do is we say to the world, give us your voice over IP traffic, and we will convert it into any protocol, any codec that you like, and we'll send it on to where it needs to go. And that's an example where when you see an emerging market, an emerging problem, it's not always the obvious thing that leads to the money. In that instance, we're not actually making money from voice over IP. We're making money because there's a lack of commonality in the way everybody else uses voice over IP. And I'll give you an example, another example that's really, really important to BT. Everybody knows Skype, don't you? Skype have a difficult challenge. They have hundreds of millions of users. It's a fantastic story. But the problem is that Skype is predominantly a free service. It's a free service because it's voice over IP, and they do breakout now, but it's very difficult if you've given somebody something for free to then come along to them afterwards and say, well, you know the way I said that was free? I'd actually like you to pay me now. What happens is people say, no thank you, I will go somewhere else. Now that's where BT, we see another advantage. If we can leverage our old network and our existing customer relationship and marry that with the new world of voice over IP, then we can make a difference. So for example, we could build an app that would sit on your iPhone or on your Android phone and allow you to use your BT landline and your BT calling package anywhere at all in the world. Anytime you have a Wi-Fi connection, you can use your BT package. And suddenly, that's starting to marry the old world and the new world. It's using innovation on the very latest tablets and phone technology. And it's letting us, in this example, potentially give our customers something that's really useful. We all know when we go abroad, it is really expensive to make phone calls. It is hugely expensive. What if I made it free? Would you like me to make it free? That's the type of offer that BT can put on the table. Now, we've already launched a product, an innovative product in that space called One Voice Anywhere 2. And that's designed for large corporates like Tech Mahindra. And what it allows you to do is using an Android app, an iPhone app, or a BlackBerry app, it allows you, no matter where you travel in the world, to make local calls to 168 countries. And that is again marrying app technology with an existing network that BT already had. So if you go back to my original thought process, legacy is a state of mind. If you stop considering the things that you've already got as legacy and start thinking about how can I use this in a different way? How can I marry this with the new technology that I see coming? What would it look like if I brought these two worlds together? I think that's a really interesting way to look at what's happening with voice. Now, the other thing that I'm passionate about as the director of voice in BT Innovate and Design, I need to make sure that BT is learning from the best of the rest. What's everybody else doing in the world? So we spend a lot of time looking at what's happening around the globe with different telecoms providers. And again, the big thing that I've learned, and I really liked the presentation about the singing this morning. Everything is different. Every country is different. And actually, there's a lot you can learn from other countries. What's innovation in one country? Well, it existed 10 years ago in another country. And I think that's really interesting as well. And I think that we can look around the world. If I tell you what's happening in the world of voice, large telcos who have over 10 million lines are pretty much all following a similar path. They've learned that voice over IP is really expensive, really hard, and that their existing voice solutions are still working and they can make them work a bit longer. So they're slowing down their move to voice over IP. That's a generic trend that you see around the world. The only places where you see it a little bit different are where you've got a very small country or a very old network. And in those places, we're seeing an acceleration of voice over IP. Now, what we look to do is learn from those countries. The only other place around the world, if you look at Australia and New Zealand, Australia and New Zealand, their governments have said, we're going to go fiber. We're going to put fiber everywhere. And that's changing again the way that they think about voice, because voice becomes just something that goes over the fiber line. So that's the other really interesting thing to think about innovation. One country's innovation is another country's legacy. And again, it comes back to the same thing. There's nothing wrong with legacy. The past can be just as important as the future. So in a nutshell then, what do I think about when I think about innovation in voice? I think about legacy as a state of mind. I never let myself believe that just because something is old, I can't make use of it in the future. I watch very carefully for the trends in the market. Who can I learn from? Who do I need to watch? What can I marry together to improve? And that means that my primary job for BT of finding that sweet spot between launching the new platforms and maintaining the old platforms That's how I do my job, and that's really the challenge.